Thank you so much, Hannes, for the very generous introduction and for the kind invitation to be here today. This is brilliant. Happy to be back at Berkeley, which is don't tell my employer, my favorite UC campus. Didn't say that. So as Hannes mentioned, this is one of the first times actually that I'm presenting what's going to be a quite short monograph that my longtime collaborator, Leonardo Impet, and I have been writing together over the past 2 years, and will come out with recent press around this summer, we hope, at least. So it kind of goes without saying that what I'm going to present is joint work that's also hugely indebted, I should also say that, to Hannes's brilliant writing on large language models. So I couldn't imagine a better place to put this up for discussion. And I would like to start with a quote about art. Quote, "If one aims to surgically remove, so to speak, the human factor from the creation of a work of art, one necessarily has to face the accusation that such a work would be literally inhuman. All laws of beauty that could potentially be computed can only be based on the human-made works of art that already exist. Such laws then only produce derivatives of what already exists, albeit in great variation." I forwarded this as a tweet here because of it. Like a tweet-like appeal, but indeed, this is not your common social media hot take of the day on AI-generated images. It's from a program that ran almost 60 years ago in 1968, to be precise, on German television. Concretely, and you can see it running here in the background, the public broadcasting program Aspekte presented a feature on the philosopher Max Bense, the so-called Stuttgart School of Computer Art, active roughly between the late 1950s and early 1970s. And yet the sentiment of this quote very much represents the current state of the discourse around the relationship of machine vision and visual culture, which is one of the things that I want to look at today. Are AI images art? And if so, are they good art? Can an AI, and in big air quotes, can an AI be creative? Can it even be an artist? And is AI the future or the end of the art world? These are the questions that dominate that discourse, but they're tired questions that have been asked and answered almost since the birth of computing itself. A 2022 New York Times headline hints at the absurdity of the current situation. Quote, "An AI-generated picture won an arts prize. Artists aren't happy." We're talking here about the Colorado State Fair's annual art competition, not the Turnout Prize. And the artists are indeed unhappy, but not because the awarded picture is art or good art. In fact, it's now itself a historical artifact, right? We don't, if you ask a current generation image generator to do something for you, it won't have all these strange artifacts that have been so common and that these images are so well known for, have been so well known for. And certainly it's not because the AI showed unprecedented aesthetic agency. The artist is unhappy because some of their work was used without consent to train a machine that would produce vastly less interesting work. If this continually resurrected debate then seems unable to progress since the 1960s or so, it's perhaps because we've been asking the wrong questions all along. Questions that are exclusively concerned with the output of artificial intelligence systems, the cliched pictures that they make, the mediocre poetry that they write, the elevator music they compose. Crucially, the AI system featured in the New York Times article behind me is published amongst an explosion of generative, mostly text-to-image AI systems. But all of these systems, the one from this article included, are powered by a model called CLIP, released in 2021. CLIP is not itself an image generator, but a text-image similarity calculator. It cannot produce images by itself at all, but it is the breakthrough that enabled the so-called multimodal turn in artificial intelligence, from which all actual image generators emerge. It's systems like CLIP then, systems that quietly work in the background and are yet informing, even determining which images can be made and why by those artificial intelligence systems that dominate the discussion, which I hope to address. More generally, I hope to convince you, or rather give you some evidence for the fact that the generative perspective that is looking at only the outputs of image or text producing AI models turns out not to be very generative at all. and is increasingly unhelpful in understanding and critiquing contemporary artificial intelligence. I'm not arguing here for a blanket dismissal of outputs, and in fact, Hannes has recently presented a very convincing argument for the surface reading of LLM outputs in particular. So I'm not arguing for the blanket dismissal of outputs, but rather for a recalibration of our critical focus, from machine images to image machines, from external to internal representations, more precisely, from pixel space to vector space. Because it is the epistemology and ideology of vector space as a space of universal commensurability on which the aesthetics of contemporary image machine rests. So we'll come back to the question of vector space soon, but I want to first return for a moment to the unhappy artist from the New York Times article to better understand the problem we are dealing with here. The idea of fooling a human jury, the article, serves as a kind of litmus test for artificially intelligent behavior. Computational mimesis. Our test for good intelligence is the same as our test for good art, the artificial passing as the natural. The modern roots of this computational mimesis must be traced back, of course, to Alan Turing's famous 1950 paper in which he proposes the imitation game, now better known as the Turing test, to tackle the question of whether machines can think. Humans cannot distinguish whether a human or a machine made this picture or wrote this poem. So goes today's version of Turing's argument, because it has fooled a colleague dragged in from the hallway, an undergraduate student, a small town art competition jury, a random sample of internet strangers, and they even prefer it over the human-made equivalent. The default position towards cultural artifacts generated by artificial intelligence systems, in other words, stands almost exclusively in the shadow of Turing, to the point where we could describe any such endeavor itself as a trivial imitation of the imitation game taken too seriously. At the same time, the critique of this Turingist, this default go-to Turingist position in all its contemporary manifestations, is informed again almost exclusively by another well-known philosophical thought experiment, philosopher of mind John Searle's 1980 Chinese Room, which also evaluates a system by fooling an external server, but this time the deceit acts as a proof against mechanical intelligence. So very briefly, how does this work? Most of you will have seen this, so I'm going to give you just a quick run through Searle. An English speaker who doesn't understand non-European languages imagines himself in a room with a large dictionary of Chinese phrases and the appropriate responses. By following instructions in English, he can look up and produce appropriate responses in Chinese, fooling those outside into believing he understands the language. Consequently, this is Searle's point, the Turing test cannot be a sufficient measure of intelligence. The actual argument is a little bit more complex. It has lots of things to do with phenomenology, but this is the gist of it. Searle's analogy itself, unsurprisingly, stands in a long philosophical tradition. Leibniz had proposed a thought experiment in which a mechanical mill acts as a brain already in section 17 of the Monadology from 1714. Leibniz's thought experiment, in turn, can be traced back to the original Cartesian problem of the location of uniquely human faculties, which we can find almost verbatim again in Turing. In his refutation of the argument from consciousness, Turing quotes Jeffrey Jefferson, who claims that it is not sufficient for a machine to write a sonnet to be considered intelligent, but that it would also need to be able to relate internally to its writing, that it would need to, quote, know that it has written. Jefferson makes explicit that this expression is, of course, and it's not simply acting in parrot fashion. Jefferson makes explicit that this expression is, of course, a reference to Descartes' original argument that, quote, magpies and parrots can utter words as we do, and yet cannot speak like us. Most interesting, however, is Turing's response to this challenge. And this will actually catapult us right back into the present most large artificial intelligence models. Because Turing essentially argues that a dialogical form of examination, a viva voce in his terms, would likely convince Jefferson that the sonnet is understood rather than just repeated or in parrot fashion. This, by no coincidence at all, is exactly what large language models are asked to do to, at the same time, enhance and evidence their reasoning capabilities in an approach now widely known as chain of thought prompting. Now, Searle, of course, would have none of this, right? After all, to him, there would be no difference between one-off answers and entire chains of thought, simply because both would emerge from the same dictionary, the same book of transition rules. We are facing here, then, a curious feedback loop of critique, where we can infinitely expand the requirements, both quantitative and qualitative, according to which certain outputs would be understood as evidence of thinking, or its diffusely weaker form reasoning, or its yet diffusely weaker form creativity. It's because of this feedback loop that contemporary critiques are almost always meant to critique a specific class of models, for instance, large language models, or even a particular model, for instance, ChatGPT, and yet inevitably regress to a critique of modeling in general. So how do we break out of this feedback? I would like to suggest that one way is to be quite a bit more strict, that is, think more concretely about the exact conditions of contemporary implementations of Turing's and Searle's respective thought experiments. Because contemporary AI systems operate on a basis that Searle could hardly have imagined. Turing might have had a slightly better time doing so, because at the end of that paper of 1950, he comes up with an idea called child machines, which really resemble in a kind of uncanny way contemporary neural network architectures. So a dictionary metaphor for the internal operation of such a system might be seen to have useful analogies to the rules-based AI systems of the last century, but not only are neural network-based language models rather different in their internal logics, the logocentric computer programs imagined by Turing and Searle are now swiftly becoming multimodal vision language systems. In Searle's thought experiment, the person in the room has no way to connect the symbols he manipulates to any sensory experience. Contemporary multimodal systems can effectively imagine what a word means by relating it to pixel values, kind of perverse embodiment in which language tokens are grounded in plausible light sensor values. Mediality then matters. It matters, in other words, how exactly Searle's dictionary is written, how it is organized, and how it is read. How knowledge enters the system, how knowledge is stored in the system, and how knowledge can be retrieved from the system. And it matters how that knowledge is originally represented in image form, in text form, in sound form, and so on. How it is represented once it has entered the system, and how it is represented when it is presented to us as a result or a solution to a task given to the system. Now, from a contemporary perspective, you might understand the unpopularity of this perspective in the context of an information economy where even the potential dangers of a technology serve as a marketing instrument. What historian of technology Lee Finsel calls greedy hype, and where polemics have to be countered with polemics. But I thus do not want to, again, dismiss the need for the effective rejection of these mainstream and, as recent events have shown, and also shown, deeply political marketing narratives. And while I also do not want to distract from the concrete exploitation of artists, of writers, of workers, first and foremost, taking place in the training and deployment of models, I'm interested here in this talk and in the book as well, in attempting to reconnect the socio-political critique of AI systems to their actual function. The inquiry is directed explicitly at the politics embedded within the internal logics of these machines. What ideologies, assumptions, and power structures govern the processes and representations that underpin? Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, to begin to answer this question, we have to turn away from machine vision and take a look at every academic's favorite model, ChatGPT. ChatGPT was released in summer of 22, and in the following months quickly captured much of the public debate around artificial intelligence, to a point where ChatGPT was the debate about artificial intelligence, you could say. In February of 2023, ChatGPT made it into the New Yorker and into the writing of one of the most prominent contemporary science fiction writers, Pat Chang. The title metaphor of Chang's article, from which this animation here is taken as well, would have been fundamentally incomprehensible to a reader 30 years ago. This is the title: ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web. In other words, ChatGPT retains much of the information on the web in the same way that a JPEG retains much of the information of a higher resolution image. But if you're looking for an exact sequence of bits, you won't find it. All you will ever get is an approximation. At the center of Chang's argument is the fact that large language models, such as ChatGPT, tend to quote-unquote hallucinate. The basic functioning relies on text completion, on finding the most plausible set of next words for a set of given words. As they do not have access to the web to verify the factual accuracy of such completions, they occasionally produce completions that sound factual, but whose true status is entirely coincidental. The most prominent example, perhaps, is the hallucination of references to academic papers that do not exist, but with plausible titles, journal names, authors, and so on. This kind of textual hallucination for Chang is a compression artifact, akin to blurring, for instance. The model has to interpolate from incomplete, from lossy information. And for Chang, this interpolation gives the impression of comprehension. Quote, when we're dealing with sequences of words, lossy compression looks smarter than lossless compression. Lossy compression in ChatGPT then does not only fulfill a pragmatic function to store a smaller version of all the text on the web, but also an ideological one. ChatGPT appears smarter because it does not repeat things in a verbatim, that is, lossless way. Plagiarism masked by paraphrasing, such that the text produced by it seems new, even if it is new. We are impressed by ChatGPT's intelligence, Chang argues, because we read its lossy compression as lossless. And while, quote, there's nothing magical or mystical about writing, it concludes, quote, it involves more than placing an existing document on an unreliable photocopier and pressing the print button. No. Chang, a trained computer scientist, is able to trace here the ideologies and the specific properties of a technical object. He sees that a critique of technology must look into the black box. But here, in this particular context, Chang's analogy is rather unhelpfully a near miss. Deep learning models, including ChatGPT, are compression systems, but of a fundamentally different kind, epistemologically and ideologically, than the sorts of compression systems we are used to deal with. So to repeat, computer scientists have traditionally spoken of two different kinds of compression: lossy compression and lossless compression. Information that has been compressed losslessly can be reconstructed in full. If you put files from your computer into a zip archive, you can, at least in theory, always get back to the full versions of these files. This is done by reducing redundancy at a statistical level, often by spotting identical sequences that reoccur and encoding them more efficiently. In image terms, an all-white image could be encoded by saving the color value white as many times as the image has pixels, or it could be encoded by saving the instruction repeat white as many times as the image has pixels. The aim, which obviously takes up less space, right, than saving a value for every single pixel if the image is about a certain size. The aim of lossy compression, on the other hand, is to produce an approximation of the original signal by exploiting our own perceptual inattention to certain kinds of information. For instance, eliminating frequencies too high to hear or to see, and MP3, right, is the most prominent example of this. Lossy compression algorithms are therefore, I think, more interesting ideologically, as by deciding what to keep and what to discard, they each contain a kind of immanent value theory of a particular medium, as Jonathan Stern demonstrates in his vivid intellectual biography of the MP3 format, or as Hitler Steil has argued in a theory of the poor image. I would like to argue that today's neural compression systems, based AI systems, cannot be identified with either model exclusively. They act at the epistemic level rather than at the level of a particular medium, and they have little to do with reducing file sizes. Indeed, they are often increasing file sizes. They are systems that claim quite explicitly to model knowledge rather than merely reconstructing data. They are, we could say, epistemic compression systems. What is more, in the age of artificial intelligence, compression in the age of artificial intelligence is understood not only as a mechanism for the representation of existing knowledge, but also for the production of new knowledge, culminating in the idea that vision itself can serve as a world simulator in contemporary models like OpenAI's video model, Sora. Claude Shannon, here at Dartmouth in the 50s, the Dartmouth workshop, the beginning of artificial intelligence, as we know it. Claude Shannon, in describing the theory of information from which we take the very notion of compression, had excluded questions of meaning, content, or semantics from its analysis of signal communication. Quote, you all know it's quote, I assume, the fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point either exactly or approximately a message selected at another point. Frequently, the messages have meaning, that is, they refer to or are correlated according to some system with certain physical or conceptual entities. These semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem. In a sharp reversal of Shannon's stance, today's neural compression systems are explicitly designed to hold information beyond what is necessary for reconstruction. The blurriness of contemporary systems that Chang observes, then, is not a technical fault, nor an explicit move to hide incorrectness, as in Chang's diagnosis. It is instead a byproduct precisely of the search for an epistemic faculty, a technical and ideological convergence in machine learning research for the past 40 years of the concept of compression with that of embedding. The mathematical theory underlying embedding, which is the concept I'll spend the next part of the talk on, in a more general sense, is the theory of vector spaces, a branch of analytical geometry mathematics, first formulated in this sense by the German mathematician Hermann Grassmann. Grassmann, later an important linguist, was for most of his career a school teacher whose contributions to mathematics were famously under-acknowledged because of the overly philosophical tone of his work. He was fond, for instance, of Schleiermacher's ideas about dialectics and opens his book with a quite thorough reflection on the epistemology of the natural sciences, which he described as thoughts from things, compared to the epistemology of mathematics, which you understand as thoughts from thoughts. Grassmann's crucial move, however, was to abandon the metaphors of three-dimensional space, to show that there's nothing special about three-dimensionality, and thus to abstract space from physical geometry. He called this theory extension theory, Ausdehnungslehre, which was to be, quote, the abstract basis of a theory of space, stripped of all geometric content. For Grassmann, extension theory was to geometry as algebra is to numbers, a way to generalize spatial geometric relations. Grassmann's writings, again, were underappreciated at the time, with a few exceptions such as Helmholtz, but rose to prominence through the influential Italian mathematician Giuseppe Peano, known for the axioms underlying set theory. Now, in an 1853 paper, Grassmann applied his notion of vector space to the problem of color. Young and Helmholtz had already shown that human retinas are sensitive to three types of color, roughly red, green, and blue, But Gassman is the first to propose such a thing as the color space, which is a vector space of color such that, quote, points close to each other in the color signal space are perceived as subjectively close. That is, they produce a small color difference between. An abstract geometric space, in other words, in which visual perceptual similarity is matched to similarity in the color space. Gassman had here anticipated both the mathematics and the epistemics of the embedding space. And although any set of numerical descriptions of an object might be considered as a vector embedding, the notion of an embedding space as a model of culture comes about more explicitly in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Gerald Salton's work on information retrieval with a so-called smart information retrieval system, which was essentially a library search engine. SMART is now better known as TF-IDF. Digital humanists will know this, term frequency, inverse document frequency, a way of modeling information where each dimension of the vector space tells you how often a particular word is used. This representation throws information away, such as the ordering of words, but is not compressed in the sense of a meaningful, even lossy recoverability of the original information. It's an essentially destructive model of documents where each point in a high-dimensional space corresponds to one document and where similar documents appear close by. But that vector space might be a useful tool to analyze a graphical, that is fundamentally discrete data such as text, is a much later addition than its use in geometry and color science, but one that lays the foundations for the later epistemic turn in artificial intelligence. Embeddings then have existed for some decades in machine learning and AI, but they became a hegemonic technical paradigm only in the 2010s. Turney had already suggested in 2006 that what he calls relational similarity might turn out to be an interesting measure of more than syntactic capabilities of vector spaces. It was also Turney who first proposed that the trope most amenable to the operationalization of relational similarity might be the analogy, which would go on to be one of the core technical metaphors of the embedded space. Mikolov et al.'s skipgram model, which you can see here on this slide, popularized the idea, however, that unsupervised language models could pick up analogies from raw text data. Now, how does this work? The textbook example of such an analogy in computer science, which recalls, by the way, the throughout bizarre gender politics of, Turing's citation game, Roosevelt perceptron was trained to distinguish men and women, and much of artificial intelligence research since then. The textbook example is the analogy: man is to king as woman is to what? The answer, which is obviously queen, is easily inferred, but until relatively recently, that is, until Mikolov's 2013 paper from the slide before, was an extremely hard problem to solve computationally. But if we compute the points for king, man, and woman with the help of a word embedding model similar to that of Mikolov et al., trained on a large corpus of natural text, that is, text picked from the web, and if we then complete the high-dimensional parallelogram that is suggested by the arrangement of these 3 points in vector space, the point that is closest to the ideal completion of that parallelogram will be the vector encoding of the word tree. Man is to king, what woman is to queen. But even more surprising is that this capability of the model translates to a more general spatial semantics. The axis on which we can move from man to woman, left to right here, and thus also from king to queen, equates more generally to gender. On it, we can also move from mother to father, from aunt to uncle, and so on and so on. But problematically, and this is exactly where contemporary research on bias in artificial intelligence begins, we can move on the same axis also from nurse to doctor without moving on another axis, let's say power, at the same time. But this other axis does exist as well in the embedding space of the model, the vertical axis. axis here. It's the axis on which we move from man to king and from woman to queen, right? So both these axes make sense, but the completion of the parallelogram only works in both ways. It is at least since the emergence of word embedding models then that AI researchers have attempted to strategically utilize and improve upon this semantic aspect of embedding spaces. Radford et al. Were the first to demonstrate already in 2015 that a similar arithmetic of meaning, as we could call it, can be implemented in the visual domain as well. More importantly, subsequent research all the way to contemporary multimodal generative models has time and again tried to neatly disentangle these axes of meaning, but has failed time and again due to the distributed nature of embeddings. And it's exactly this distributed nature that brings us closer, a little bit at least, to what I think is the ideological core of the vector space as a tool for modeling culture. Consider the three shapes behind me. They might have been produced by some kind of computer graphics software, and they're made up entirely of straight edges. And as such, they're called polygons. How might a simple computer algorithm compare them? You first need to define a commensurable unit. We might choose the center of mass or the perimeter, but the simplest common measurement would seem to be the area of the shapes. You then need a way of calculating these areas. Though we might know the formula for squares, regular pentagons, and so forth, it would be impractical to include every such formula in our computer program. And in any case, there are more exotic shapes, right, for which simple formula simply do not exist. A simpler solution then is to split up our shapes into triangles, measure the area of each triangle, and then add up these measurements. This process will be familiar to practically any student of computer science as polygon triangulation. Practically any virtual 3D object in video games or in Hollywood blockbusters is made up of such triangles. But this process of collapsing different kinds of images into the same metric space, right, is by some coincidence the metaphor Karl Marx chooses to introduce the concept of exchange value. Marx writes, in order to calculate and compare the areas of rectangular figures, we decompose them into triangles. But the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure, namely by half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which they represent a greater or less quantity. Now, commodities and their famous Marx quote, metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, have of course been at the center of many of the most recent revitalizations of Marxism. And I bring this up here not to revisit or rehash these debates, nor to steer my argument towards recent explicitly Marxist critiques of artificial intelligence, such as Michael Spinelli's, for instance, or just in jokes, but to point out the fundamentally geometric nature of commensurability. Operationalization, as famously pointed out by Franco Moretti, reading P.W. Richman, means understanding a process as a definition. Length is nothing but the act of measurement. This insight has been at the core of digital humanities work for the past 2 decades or so, but it attains a new significance in the age of machine learning. Measuring culture today means vectorizing culture, making cultural artifacts commensurable through vector media. Today, then, we see the rise of another kind of equivalent form in the sphere of culture that goes far beyond its mere digitization or commercialization, as in Adorno and Horkheimer's account of the culture industries. Let's call this commensurability enforced by embeddings, enforced by vectors, neural exchange value. Computational commodities, as we could call them, are characterized by their double nature, firstly as texts, as images, as sounds, but also as embeddings. Of course, media objects have been commodities long before neural networks, but only in the sense of market exchange. Now they are also commodities in terms of neural exchange. Because everything can be projected into an embedding space: words, images, sounds, and protein structures. This is the promise exactly of highly multimodal artificial intelligence systems, of foundation models, and ultimately of artificial general intelligence. And in fact, computer scientists are quite straightforward about their ideological ambitions in that regard. Take, for instance, the work of Geoff Hinton, godfather of AI and Turing Nobel Prize winner, famous for introducing backpropagation to AI in the 1980s, a gradient-based method for actually training neural networks, allowing deeper, many-layer neural networks to be trained practically for the first time. Again, we might say that this innovation is conceptual, ideological, rather than strictly technical. Backpropagation seems to have been mathematically invented independently twice before Hinton's paper, but not used for this purpose. As Hinton himself explained, "I've never claimed that I invented backpropagation. Bruno Harder invented it independently long after people in other fields had invented it. What I have claimed is that I was the person to clearly demonstrate that backpropagation could learn interesting internal representations, and that is what made it popular." Now, where did Hinton's interest in these interesting internal representations, embeddings, as I've been calling them, emerge? In his 1977 PhD at the University of Edinburgh, Hinton was working on dealing with visual ambiguity in image recognition. He was interested specifically in the problem of, quote, organizing the interactions between different hypotheses during the process of constructing the internal representations of a scene. This is a classic computer vision problem, right? How do you describe a complex visual scene rather than just a simple object or a simple shape? Computer vision systems, Hinton argues, need to evaluate several potentially contradictory hypotheses in parallel, which might then be compared numerically in order to find the best one. But just as striking, I think, as Marx's computer graphics analogy for exchange value is Geoff Hinton's own analogy for the creation of a space of competing hypotheses in computer vision. Hinton writes, "In Capital, Marx puts forward the idea that there must be some common underlying essence shared by all goods in order to explain how they can be given prices according to which they are exchanged. The same philosophical point seems to apply to hypotheses. There must be some property which they share in order to explain how they can be given scores according to which they are traded. Obvious candidate here is probability." Now, if the internal representations of computer vision algorithms seem well described by Marxian economics, then it's perhaps because the founder of modern computer vision and artificial intelligence based his ideas quite explicitly on Marx's notion of exchange value. As well as, quote, internal representations, Hinton sometimes calls these embeddings distributed representations. Now, in the 1980s, the conventional way of representing information in a network was to assign one element of memory to each possible input. If text were represented via these local representations, now more often called one-hot encodings, each possible word in a fixed dictionary would be represented by a single element in the embedding vector, with all other values being 0. In this system, each memory location was isolated, with no intrinsic relationship between words. Hinton, instead, was a major proponent for a distributed representation, one in which information about a stimulus is distributed throughout the vector in memory. And the advantage of such a distributed representation is that it provides a continuous space, a space in which the space between existing data points can be explored. A space, in other words, in which interstitial concepts can be interpolated from existing ones. Again, Hinton writes, comparing distributed and local representations from the standpoint of creating new concepts. Local representations appear to require a nucleus with a soldering iron. Distributed representations are more flexible, allowing concepts to be formed gradually by weight modifications that progressively differentiate one old concept into several new ones. In short, Hinton's revolutionary proposal here is not technical, but epistemic. It revolves around the claim of being able to generate new knowledge. If early versions of embedded knowledge, like Salton's document space then, were construed as essentially structuralist operationalizations, mappings of abstract document properties to vector space axes, Hinton takes us quite explicitly, as it turns out, beyond this structuralist paradigm and towards a paradigm that we might call post-structuralist. Meaning and knowledge for Hinton are to be found in the gaps between the representations, not in the representations themselves. These gaps, as the case of word embeddings makes abundantly clear, come into existence in the first place only because continuity is added to the representations, a potential for being more than they are. Now, obviously, the aim of what is now called post-structuralist philosophy could not be further from the aims of artificial intelligence research. We could easily speak here of a sort of technical rendering of difference, but somewhat ironically, that would itself be another forced analogy enabled by embeddings. Instead, consider that critiques of artificial intelligence often assume that AI research is tethered to an ideology of classification. For example, the well-known deficiencies of datasets like ImageNet are frequently cited as evidence of epistemic flaws, suggesting that the structure of a dataset determines the epistemology of a model trained on it. However, this critique misses a critical distinction. The goal of challenges like ImageNet is not to perfect classification systems, but to actually push beyond. The assumption that AI models are inherently bound to predefined labels fails to account for the transformative potential of embeddings. Unlike traditional classification systems, embeddings do not require axes. They operate as a one-way process. Embedded objects are not recoverable in their original form anymore, and the relationships between them do not depend on fixed taxonomies or categories. This shift, I think, signifies a departure from the 1990s discourse, which you could summarize as everything is binary, which means everything is classification, which means everything is flawed, where digital media were often equated with strict taxonomies and hierarchical classification systems. Contemporary AI reveals something far more fluid, a transformation in the relationship between form and content, between syntax and semantics. A fluidity reminiscent of the foundational architectures of Turing and von Neumann, whose great innovation was exactly to dissolve the boundary between data and code. If the media theory of the 1990s had to discover the computer as a medium in the first place, today's media theory has to grapple with the fact that all media are dissolved in the modeling of cultural artifacts with embeddings, a total media collapse that stands in stark contrast to the eschatological predictions dominating contemporary AI critiques. Now, Marx and Engels famously described the downfall of the bourgeoisie as inevitable. Capitalism produces its own great leaders. The optimism of historical inevitability now finds an uncanny echo amongst critical commentators of artificial intelligence, a language of inevitable fate. Terms like mode collapse and model collapse litter the discourse of AI, often invoked interchangeably by cultural commentators, although they refer to technically unrelated phenomena. Unfortunately, as we will see, these failures of AI do not mark its unraveling. Instead, they signal its deeper entanglement in the systems of production, moderation, and control. Mode collapse describes a failure mode of generative adversarial networks, where the generative model, in seeking to minimize its loss function, learns to reproduce only a fragment of the training data's distribution. It's a failure that reveals itself vividly. A model trained on handwritten digits might lose itself in the contours of the 0 and the 1, forgetting entirely the rest of the numerical spectrum. The collapse here is stark, catastrophic, and easily visualized, a narrowing of diversity to a single repetitive kernel. Model collapse, on the other hand, occurs when AI models are trained on data which includes the output of previous models, something seen as likely for models trained on large quantities of images or text from the internet. However, model collapse does not signify the dramatic implosion of AI systems that its confusion with mode collapse in generative adversarial networks suggests. Mode collapse represents a catastrophic failure mode where the system effectively ceases to generate meaningful diversity in its output, restricting itself to a narrow subset of its input distribution. In contrast, model collapse entails something far more insidious, a progressive smoothing of the outputs marked by a reduction in complexity and unpredictability. It's less a dramatic collapse than a kind of entropic drift towards mediocrity, a narrowing of the possibilities of expression as the system becomes more predictable, less glitchy, and more uniform in its patterns. In technical terms, this can be measured as a reduction in perplexity, a key metric in language modeling that captures how well a model predicts a sequence of text. As models consume their own outputs in training loops, the diversity of their generated outputs diminishes, creating a feedback loop of homogenization. Language becomes dominated by statistically probable but less imaginative constructions. If embedding spaces are spaces for the neural commodification of media, then this phenomenon can be understood as a kind of financialization of media. Just as financial markets have increasingly subordinated the natural economies of goods and services to abstracted systems of exchange, model collapse suggests that the embedding, the vectorized abstraction of meaning, comes to dominate over the natural form of language, images, or other data. The natural form becomes subservient to the exchange form as embeddings operate as a universal currency of meaning. Marshall McLuhan famously argued that media are always defined in relation to other media. A new medium is always an extension, amplification, or transformation of an existing one. Yet in the era of embeddings, this relationship is fundamentally altered. Neural networks are a kind of violent meta-media, capable of representing all media to the universal language of vector embeddings. Vector media dissolve all others. But at the same time, just like the constantly repeated inevitability of capitalism does discourage but not foreclose its critique, the omnipresence of the vector space does not mean that it cannot be grappled with critically or technically. In fact, one of the most critical openings I see is that the parallelity and fundamental incompatibility of vector spaces somewhat contradicts their claim to universality. The debate around foundation models has successfully obscured the fact that the centralization of model development is, just like the dissolution of culture into no exchange value, only ideologically but not technically consistent. At any moment, multiple models are competing with each other. And the market crash introduced by the release of the Chinese DeepSeek model tells us that this situation is unlikely to be resolved. There is, in other words, no unified latent space of culture, as Ted Underwood has suggested in one of the first popular critiques of vector space hegemony. Not only are individual models necessarily limited in their training data, there is, to stay within the analogy of exchange value, no gold standard and no currency exchange. Quite literally, investing in OpenAI means one can never invest in DeepSeek and vice versa. And even on the technical level, we can find many operational admissions of defeat. Skip connections, which exists in all large models, retain at least some media specificity, without which the model training would never converge. Large visual models have to develop their own emulations of media, which, for instance, allows the quite precise setting of photographic parameters, f-stop, lenses, and so on in image. It's more the same kind of conservation happens also on the architecture level, where smaller and older models are often integrated into the processing pipeline of a larger model. The specter of previous models, in that sense, haunts the AI systems of today. The significantly obsolete ImageNet-trained BGG19 model, for instance, is still responsible for the computation of the so-called perceptual distance between two images in many contemporary large models, which means that all problems of BGG are translated to the more contemporary models. It's due to these small pockets of technical specificity, these implementation details, that the ideology of neural exchange value begins to stand on shaky grounds. It matters, quote, where the model meets the machine, to speak with the historian of science, Stephanie Dick, because only here do we get the opportunity to speak of the machine's ideology and thus of the machine's epistemology and thus of the machine's politics concretely. Thank you.